Welcome, traveler, to Forgotten Worlds for Sleep. Tonight, we journey back 7 centuries to an age of stone castles, holy vows, and secret brotherhoods. The story you are about to hear is not just of knights in white mantles and red crosses. It is a tale of faith and betrayal, of unimaginable power and sudden downfall. From 9 humble warriors guarding pilgrims on lonely roads, the Knights Templar rose to become the most feared and respected order in Christendom. They built fortresses that touched the sky, controlled treasure that rivaled kings, and stood firm in battles where empires trembled. But their end came not from foreign enemies, but from the very powers they had once served. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the echoes of their footsteps guide you through forgotten corridors of history. This is the saga of the Templars, the warriors, the bankers, the martyrs, and the legends who never truly died. The closing decades of the 11th century were an age of turbulence and transformation across Europe. A continent long fragmented by feudal rivalries and local power struggles was beginning to knit itself together under the unifying authority of the Catholic Church. Yet this unity was fragile, contested, and often violent. To understand the rise of the Knights Templar, an order that would shape the Middle Ages in ways few could have predicted, we must first return to this world on the cusp of monumental change. Feudalism dominated European society. Kings and emperors might claim crowns, but real power often rested in the hands of nobles who controlled fortresses, farmland, and the loyalty of mounted warriors. Castles dotted the countryside like islands of stone, each lord ruling his domain through oaths of fealty and the promise of protection. For peasants, life was harsh and local. They worked the land, owed taxes to their lords, and lived under constant threat of famine, disease, or war. Few would ever travel more than a few miles from the villages where they were born. Above this patchwork of lords and vassals stood the church. By the end of the 11th century, the papacy had emerged as the most powerful single institution in Western Europe. Reforming movements, particularly those stemming from Cluny and the influence of Pope Gregory VII, had centralized authority in Rome and asserted the supremacy of spiritual over temporal rulers. It was a world where excommunication could unmake kings, and the moral authority of the Pope shaped both politics and the private lives of the faithful. At the same time, the Christian imagination had grown increasingly captivated by Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Pilgrimage had always been a central expression of medieval piety, but journeys eastward were particularly perilous. Tales of robbery, violence, and desecration of sacred sites spread through monasteries and marketplaces. Whether exaggerated or real, these stories stirred outrage in a continent already aflame with religious fervor. To walk where Christ had walked was the highest devotion. To be prevented from doing so was an affront that demanded redress. Beyond Europe's borders, the Islamic world was flourishing. From Baghdad to Cordoba, Muslim scholars advanced science, mathematics, and medicine, preserving ancient knowledge that European centers of learning had long neglected. The holy city of Jerusalem, under shifting Muslim dynasties, contained not only the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but also the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, each revered by different faiths. For centuries, Muslim rulers had allowed Christian pilgrims to visit, but the balance of power was shifting. The Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam, expanded aggressively, defeating Byzantine forces at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The Christian East, embodied by the once mighty Byzantine Empire, now faced existential threats. It was into this atmosphere that Emperor Alexios I Komnenos of Byzantium set his desperate plea for aid to the West. His request for mercenaries to help hold back the Turks would spark a chain of events beyond his imagining. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II transformed a local military problem into a spiritual mission of cosmic scale. In stirring language, he called upon knights of Christendom to lay down their arms against one another and march instead to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. His rallying cry, Deus Vult, God wills it, reverberated across Europe. The response was extraordinary. Tens of thousands took the cross, sewing red symbols onto their tunics as signs of their vow. Some sought salvation, others sought land, wealth, or adventure. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, was chaotic and brutal. Entire villages marched east, families in tow, driven by visions of holy war. The People's Crusade, poorly led and ill-equipped, was massacred before reaching the Holy Land. Yet the main armies of knights, drawn from France and beyond, achieved the unthinkable. They captured Jerusalem in 1099. The conquest was drenched in blood. Chroniclers spoke of streets running red, of warriors ankle-deep in gore as Muslims and Jews were slaughtered in the Holy City. To medieval Christians, this violence was justified, even sanctified. To modern eyes, it reveals the brutal contradictions of an age where faith and ferocity were inseparable. Out of this carnage emerged fragile crusader states, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But holding Jerusalem proved far harder than taking it. Most crusaders returned home after fulfilling their vows, leaving a thin scattering of settlers and soldiers to defend vast new territories surrounded by hostile forces. Pilgrims continued to arrive in growing numbers, their devotion undimmed by the dangers of travel. Yet these same dangers, bandits, raiders, and rival armies, threatened not just individuals, but the very survival of the new Christian outposts. It was in this crucible of insecurity that the idea for a new kind of order was born. Warriors who were not simply knights bound to lords, nor monks cloistered in abbeys, but men who would merge the sword and the cross in one vocation. Their mission would be to guard the pilgrims, defend the roads, and stand as living shields of Christendom. In 1119, a handful of French knights stepped forward with this radical vision. They could not have known that their humble vow would ignite one of the most extraordinary stories in medieval history, the rise and fall of the Knights Templar. The story of the Templars cannot be told without first understanding the moment that ignited the crusading movement. It was November 1095, in the French town of Clermont, when Pope Urban II delivered a sermon that would reverberate across Christendom and alter the course of history. The setting was no ordinary gathering. Urban had summoned clergy, nobles, and common folk to hear his message. Rumors had already spread that the Pope intended to call for action against the infidels in the East, but few could have imagined the fervor of the words that poured forth. Chroniclers later wrote that his voice carried both fire and honey, searing the hearts of knights while soothing their doubts with promises of eternal reward. Urban's speech was brilliantly crafted. He condemned the violence of Christian knights who shed one another's blood in endless feudal quarrels. Why waste courage and skill in petty wars? He asked, when a holy cause awaited. He then painted a vivid picture of Jerusalem under Muslim rule, describing desecration of holy sites and the suffering of pilgrims. The truth of these claims mattered little. What mattered was their effect. Outrage and righteous anger swept through the crowd. Then came the promise. Urban declared that any knight who took up the cross and journeyed east would receive a plenary indulgence, the remission of all temporal punishment for sin. For men and women of the 11th century, haunted by visions of hellfire and longing for salvation, this was irresistible. The Holy Land became not merely a battlefield, but a pathway to heaven. The response was immediate. Shouts of Deus Vult, God wills it, erupted from the assembly. Knights fell to their knees, pledging themselves to the cause. Men stitched the cross onto their garments as a living symbol of their vow. The crusade was born not in quiet strategy, but in a storm of faith and emotion. Yet beneath the religious zeal lay worldly motives. Younger sons of noble families, unlikely to inherit estates, saw the chance for land and glory in distant lands. Merchants imagined new trade routes. Even peasants, weary of toil, dreamed of liberation through pilgrimage and war. The crusade offered something for everyone: salvation for the soul, adventure for the restless, and fortune for the ambitious. The armies that gathered were a strange mix of piety and chaos. Some bands marched without weapons or provisions, convinced God would provide. Others, led by powerful nobles, carried banners and retinues worthy of kings. The People's Crusade, led by the charismatic preacher Peter the Hermit, set out first. Composed largely of peasants and zealots, it was annihilated in Anatolia, leaving fields littered with the dead. Yet their martyrdom only fueled determination in the armies that followed. In 1096, the main crusader host departed. Great lords of France and beyond: Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Godfrey of Bouillon, marshaled knights and infantry numbering in the tens of thousands. They crossed hostile lands, endured starvation, disease, and betrayal, yet pressed ever onward. Against staggering odds, they carved a path through Anatolia, besieged Antioch, and at last reached Jerusalem in 1099. The siege of the Holy City was brutal. Starvation gnawed at the Crusaders, disease weakened their ranks, yet their desperation sharpened their resolve. When the walls were finally breached, an orgy of violence followed. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were massacred in numbers that shocked even some Christian chroniclers. To the Crusaders, it was divine justice. To their enemies, it was terror. And yet in that moment, the impossible had been achieved. The most sacred city in Christendom was once again under Christian rule. Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the Crusade's great leaders, refused the title of king, declaring himself instead defender of the Holy Sepulchre. His humility set a tone, but it did not solve the looming problem. Most crusaders, having fulfilled their vows, returned home. The fragile new kingdom of Jerusalem, along with the counties of Edessa, Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch, stood perilously exposed. These outposts of Christendom were surrounded by powerful Muslim states and cut off from consistent reinforcements. The pilgrimages did not stop. On the contrary, they increased. The Holy Land, once conquered, drew even greater numbers of devout travelers. Yet these pilgrims found themselves in grave danger. The roads from Jaffa to Jerusalem, from coastal ports to sacred shrines, teemed with bandits, raiders, and hostile forces eager to strike vulnerable groups. Tales of pilgrims robbed, murdered, or left to die in the wilderness spread across Europe, casting doubt on whether the Holy City could be reached at all. The crusading dream risked collapse. Victory at Jerusalem would mean little if Christians could not safely walk its streets. And so the cry went out, not for more armies, but for guardians. Men who would dedicate themselves not to fleeting campaigns, but to the daily protection of pilgrims and the defense of Christendom's most sacred lands. It was within this crucible of fear, faith, and fragility that the idea of a new kind of brotherhood took form. Not monks withdrawn from the world, nor knights bound by feudal oaths, but warrior monks who fused prayer and battle, discipline and courage. From their ranks would rise the most enigmatic and powerful order of the Middle Ages, the Knights Templar. The First Crusade was not merely a military campaign. It was a collision of faith, ambition, and desperation that reshaped the medieval world. From 1096 to 1099, it unfolded as both miracle and massacre, a triumph of faith and a testimony to the brutal realities of holy war. When the great armies of knights, foot soldiers, and camp followers set out from Western Europe, they carried little unity beyond their vows. Lords like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Hugh of Vermandois each commanded their own contingents. Rivalries and pride simmered beneath the surface, yet a shared vision bound them to reclaim Jerusalem. The journey itself was a crucible. Crossing through Byzantine territory tested both patience and trust. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had asked for mercenaries, not an uncontrolled flood of armed pilgrims. He demanded oaths of fealty from Crusader leaders, securing promises to return captured lands to Byzantine rule. Some swore reluctantly, others not at all, sowing seeds of future tension. The first great challenge came at Antioch in 1097 to 1098. The city, ringed with formidable walls, resisted for months. Crusaders starved, gnawed on boiled leather, and watched comrades die of disease. Yet they endured. When betrayal from within opened the gates, the Crusaders stormed the city. Their joy was short-lived. Almost immediately, a massive Muslim relief force surrounded them. Trapped inside, emaciated and exhausted, the Crusaders seemed doomed. It was then that faith and desperation worked a strange alchemy. A vision claimed by a monk revealed the location of the Holy Lance, said to be the spear that pierced Christ's side. Whether relic or forgery mattered little. It electrified the starving army. With newfound zeal, they launched a desperate charge and shattered the besieging force. Antioch was theirs, and the crusade staggered onward. By the summer of 1099, Jerusalem itself lay within reach. But this city was no longer a distant dream. Its golden dome of the rock shimmered under the Levantine sun, guarded by defenders who knew the stakes as well as the invaders. The Crusaders, reduced in number and worn by years of war, encircled the walls. They built siege towers, hauled timbers across miles, and prepared for a final assault. On July 15th, the walls were breached. What followed seared itself into history. Chroniclers described Christian knights wading through blood in the streets, slaughtering Muslim and Jewish inhabitants alike. Entire families were cut down, sacred spaces defiled. To the victors, it was God's judgment. To their enemies, it was apocalypse. Even contemporary Christian writers admitted the ferocity was beyond comprehension. Yet amid the horror, a new Christian kingdom was born. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, along with the Crusader states of Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli, represented not just military conquest, but an experiment in governance. Castles rose along trade routes. European lords ruled over diverse populations of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. But the victories masked fragility. Most Crusaders, having fulfilled their vows, returned home. Only a few thousand settlers and soldiers remained to hold vast stretches of territory against hostile neighbors. The new rulers relied on reinforcements from Europe that came sporadically at best. Their survival depended on fragile alliances, occasional truces, and the constant flow of pilgrims from the west. For the pilgrims, however, reaching Jerusalem remained as dangerous as ever. The roads from Jaffa to the Holy Sepulchre were riddled with bandits. Raiding parties struck travelers without mercy. Families who had braved the seas to walk in Christ's footsteps were cut down before reaching their destination. The holy city might be in Christian hands, but the journey to it was perilous. This problem gnawed at the conscience of Christendom. What good was Jerusalem's liberation if pilgrims could not safely pray at its shrines? The Crusaders had captured the city, but they had not secured it. A new solution was required, one not tied to temporary armies or fickle noble ambitions. It was here that the seeds of the Templars were sown. Out of the blood and fire of the First Crusade, amid the joy of conquest and the despair of insecurity, arose the vision of a brotherhood unlike any the world had seen. Knights who would not march home when vows were complete, but who would remain, permanently, faithfully, endlessly, defending the roads, guarding the pilgrims, and holding Christendom's fragile frontier. The First Crusade ended in victory, but it left behind more questions than answers. Could these fragile states endure? Could Europe sustain its distant colonies in the east? And who would protect the faithful who flocked to Jerusalem? The answers would come in the form of 9 knights who, a generation later, dared to imagine themselves both monks and warriors. The The Knights Templar had not yet been born, but the world that demanded them had. The First Crusade had delivered Jerusalem into Christian hands, but the dream of secure access to the Holy Land was far from reality. For the countless pilgrims who yearned to walk where Christ had walked, the dangers of the journey were as great as ever, sometimes greater. The holy city might gleam in the distance, but the road to reach it was lined with hardship, bandits, and death. Pilgrimage was no casual undertaking. For medieval Christians, it was a profound act of devotion and penance. Men and women sold property, bid farewell to families, and undertook journeys of months or even years. Many believed that reaching Jerusalem, praying at the Holy Sepulchre, or touching relics of Christ's Passion could cleanse them of sin. A pilgrimage might secure eternal salvation, or at least remission of purgatorial suffering. But to earn this grace, one had to survive the road. From the moment pilgrims set foot on Levantine soil, the dangers multiplied. The sea voyage itself was treacherous. Ships wrecked in storms, passengers starved in calms, or fell prey to pirates. Those who arrived at the port of Jaffa, gateway to Jerusalem, found themselves in hostile country. The inland road wound through rough terrain, hillsides and forests that provided perfect cover for raiders. Pilgrims, often traveling in small groups with little knowledge of the land, were easy prey. Contemporary accounts speak of ambushes where families were stripped, beaten, and left for dead. Women were abducted, men slaughtered. Some pilgrims never even made it to Jerusalem, their bones left to bleach under the Levantine sun. Worse still, organized Muslim raiding parties, taking advantage of the Crusader state's weakness, struck not only pilgrims, but outlying settlements. The Christian lords of Jerusalem could not guard every road. The survivors who reached the holy city often arrived in a state of exhaustion, starving and terrified. Yet still they came. Their faith burned brighter than fear. Reports of miracles, healings, visions, forgiveness circulated through Europe, drawing more to attempt the dangerous pilgrimage. The more pilgrims came, the more targets appeared for bandits and raiders. The fragile Crusader states faced a crisis. They had seized Jerusalem, but they lacked the manpower to protect its lifeblood, the steady stream of pilgrims who gave meaning to its conquest. If Christians lost the ability to reach their holy sites safely, the kingdom of Jerusalem would wither from within. Kings and lords attempted piecemeal solutions. Escorts were organized, castles built along strategic passes, patrols dispatched. Yet resources were stretched too thin. The rulers of Outremer struggled simply to defend their own walls and fields. Protecting every pilgrim caravan proved impossible. And so, stories of tragedy multiplied. One account tells of a large group of pilgrims, weary but joyful as they neared the city. They carried offerings of candles and coins for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Somewhere along the winding road from Jaffa, raiders descended. The pilgrims fought with sticks and knives, but the raiders were mounted and armed. By the time help arrived, dozens lay dead, their offerings scattered in the dust. Such stories horrified Europe, undermining the sense of divine triumph from the First Crusade. It was in these conditions of peril that whispers began. Perhaps what Christendom needed was not another wave of temporary crusaders, but a permanent guard, not mercenaries bound by wages, nor nobles distracted by ambition, but men devoted solely to protecting pilgrims. The idea was radical. In the medieval imagination, monks were meant to pray, fast, and withdraw from the world. Knights were meant to fight for lords and land. To merge these two identities into one figure, a warrior monk, seemed impossible. Yet the need was undeniable. By the second decade of the 12th century, the crisis reached its breaking point. Pilgrims continued to die on the roads. The kingdom of Jerusalem remained vulnerable. It was then that a French knight named Hugh de Payens, together with 8 companions, proposed something extraordinary: to bind themselves by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and dedicate their swords to the protection of Christ's pilgrims. At first, the idea seemed almost laughable. 9 knights, no wealth, no army. How could they hope to patrol the perilous highways of the Holy Land? Yet from these humble beginnings, a revolution would emerge. Their vision, born of desperation and faith, would soon give rise to the most feared and respected order of the Middle Ages. The road from Jaffa to Jerusalem remained treacherous, but now, for the first time, a new kind of brotherhood stood ready to defend it. The era of the Knights Templar was about to begin. The kingdom of Jerusalem was fragile, a Christian outpost surrounded by powerful enemies and weakened by its own lack of manpower. Amid this uncertainty, one knight envisioned a solution that was both audacious and unprecedented. His name was Hugh de Payens, a minor noble from Champagne in northern France. Though not among the greatest lords of his age, he carried with him something rarer than wealth, conviction. Around 1119, Hugh gathered 8 companions, men of similar background, knights who had fought in the Crusades, but who now sought a mission greater than personal glory. Together, they proposed a daring vow. They would renounce their former lives, give up claims to wealth, land, and family, and dedicate themselves wholly to the protection of pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. Their lives would be spent not in courts or castles, but on the dusty, perilous roads where danger stalked the faithful. It was a bold experiment. They were not monks, cloistered behind monastery walls. They were not mercenaries, serving for pay. They were something new, a hybrid of soldier and monk, a brotherhood that fused prayer with swordsmanship. The medieval imagination had little precedent for such men. To fight was noble, to pray was holy. To do both, in equal measure, was revolutionary. At first, their numbers seemed laughably small. 9 knights against countless bandits, raiders, and armies? How could such a handful defend the highways of Christendom? Skeptics dismissed them as idealists, but Hugh de Payens believed that their discipline and faith gave them power beyond numbers. He envisioned an order bound not by wealth or feudal obligation, but by sacred vows, loyal to God above all else. Their vow of poverty was not symbolic. These knights had little more than the clothes on their backs and the weapons in their hands. They depended on alms, gifts, and charity. Their symbol became 2 knights sharing 1 horse, a reminder that they had nothing and shared everything. This humility, far from diminishing their reputation, drew admiration. In a world where lords flaunted silks and jewels, these warriors wore plain mantles and simple armor. They fought not for riches, but for Christ. Jerusalem's King Baldwin, too, recognized the potential of their mission. Pilgrims continued to die on the roads. No amount of castles or patrols could fully solve the problem. The idea of a permanent, disciplined force dedicated solely to protection was appealing. Baldwin offered the knights quarters on the Temple Mount itself, in a wing of the royal palace that overlooked the site where the Jewish Temple of Solomon once stood. From this headquarters, they would become known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or simply the Templars. The location carried enormous symbolic weight. To live and train on the Temple Mount tied the new order directly to biblical history. Here it was said, Solomon had built his great temple, the heart of Israel's ancient faith. For the knights, it was a daily reminder of their sacred mission. Their home was not just a fortress, it was a holy ground. Life under Hugh de Payens was harsh, but purposeful. The brothers rose before dawn for prayers, fasted regularly, and obeyed strict rules of silence and humility. Yet when duty called, they mounted their horses and rode into danger without hesitation. Pilgrims soon began to speak of these knights in awe, men who prayed like monks but fought like lions. Still, their survival was precarious. Without broader support, their order might have remained a footnote in history. Hugh knew that if the Templars were to endure, they needed recognition, not only from kings, but from the Church itself. In 1127, he embarked on a journey back to Europe, carrying with him a vision of the Brotherhood's future. In France, Hugh found a powerful ally in Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his time. Bernard, a Cistercian abbot known for his fiery sermons and mystical writings, saw in the Templars a divine calling. He praised them as a new breed of holy warrior, men who fought not for plunder but for God's justice. His words would transform the perception of the order from curious experiment to sacred necessity. Under Hugh's leadership, the Templars began as a handful of poor knights with nothing but faith. Yet within a few decades, they would grow into the most powerful and feared military religious order in Europe. The spark that Hugh lit in Jerusalem would blaze across Christendom, carried by the conviction that a knight could be both warrior and monk, both humble and mighty. What began as a vision on the dangerous roads of the Holy Land was about to reshape medieval society itself. The year was 1119, and the new brotherhood of Hugh de Payens had just taken its most decisive step. By order of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, the small band of knights was granted quarters within one of the most sacred sites on earth, the Temple Mount. From this moment, their identity would be forever linked with the ancient stones of Jerusalem, and their destiny would stretch far beyond the roads they were sworn to guard. The Temple Mount was no ordinary residence. According to Scripture, it was the very place where Solomon had built his great temple, the dwelling of God's presence in the Old Testament. Though centuries of conquest and destruction had altered its appearance, the site still carried immense spiritual weight for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. To live there was to breathe history. To guard it was to stand at the heart of the world's holiest city. For the knights, their quarters were not lavish. They occupied a section of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which Crusaders had repurposed as a royal palace. Beneath them lay subterranean vaults and passageways that stirred both fascination and mystery. Later generations would speculate endlessly about what the Templars may have discovered in those underground chambers. Treasures, relics, even the Ark of the Covenant. Legends aside, what mattered most in the moment was symbolism. They were no longer just knights with a mission. They were guardians of the temple. From this headquarters, their reputation began to grow. Pilgrims entering Jerusalem saw them not as mercenaries, but as holy warriors living atop sacred ground. Their very presence on the Temple Mount linked them to divine history. To wear their mantle was to claim both spiritual purity and military might. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Templars, were now inseparable from the most powerful religious symbol of their age. Daily life at the headquarters was rigorous. The brothers rose before dawn, reciting prayers in the dim light of the Holy Mount. Meals were simple, often bread, vegetables, and watered wine, consumed in silence. Weapons were cleaned with the same care as chalices in a monastery. Horses were treated with reverence, for they were as essential to battle as swords and lances. The Temple Mount was both barracks and monastery, a place where martial discipline fused with spiritual devotion. For Jerusalem's rulers, the arrangement was practical as well as symbolic. Pilgrims continued to arrive, and the kingdom needed protection it could not afford to provide. By granting the knights quarters in so holy a place, Baldwin II lent them legitimacy and visibility. They were no longer an obscure band of enthusiasts. They were a sanctioned force of guardians, yet not all looked upon them with admiration. Some nobles scoffed at their poverty. 9 knights, sworn to protect pilgrims, seemed too few to make any real difference. Others muttered uneasily at the idea of monks bearing swords. Was it truly holy to kill, even in defense of the faith? The Templars lived under suspicion as much as under praise, straddling a line between devotion and violence that unsettled many in Christendom. Hugh de Payens understood that their survival depended on more than valor. If the order was to endure, it needed recognition from the church itself. The knights might hold the Temple Mount, but without papal approval their existence could be questioned at any time. And so, in the late 1120s, Hugh set out from Jerusalem on a mission that would take him back to the courts and abbeys of Europe. As he departed, the Temple Mount remained the beating heart of the Brotherhood. Every stone, every prayer, every sword raised beneath its arches forged their identity. What had begun as a desperate experiment, 9 Knights with a Vision, was now taking shape as a movement that would sweep across Christendom. The Temple Mount headquarters gave the order its name, its sacred aura, and its enduring mystique. But Hugh's journey to Europe would give it something even more vital: legitimacy and power. From the very beginning, the Knights Templar embraced poverty not as a misfortune, but as a spiritual weapon. Their official name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, was not symbolic exaggeration. It was reality. Unlike the glittering courts of feudal lords, the Templar Brotherhood lived with a simplicity that astonished contemporaries and drew suspicion as much as admiration. Chroniclers record that in their earliest days, the knights were so destitute that 2 men often shared a single horse. This image became so iconic that the order later adopted it on their seal. 2 armored knights riding together, a symbol both of their humility and their unity. Where other knights might boast of jeweled armor or banners of silk, the Templars wore plain white mantles, unadorned save for the red cross granted to them later by papal decree. They sought to reflect purity, not vanity. Meals were deliberately sparse. Brothers gathered at long wooden tables, eating in silence while scripture was read aloud. Meat was limited, often to 3 times a week, and wine was diluted with water. This discipline served both spiritual and practical purposes. By denying themselves indulgence, the brothers resisted temptation and maintained physical readiness for the hardships of campaign. Even their horses ate simple fodder, though Templars cared for them with near-religious devotion, recognizing them as comrades in arms. The vow of poverty extended beyond possessions. A knight who joined the order surrendered all his wealth and inheritance. Noble families, sometimes reluctant to lose a son's fortune, were reassured that these donations would serve the defense of Christendom. Once inside, however, the knight himself owned nothing, not a coin, not a cloak, not even the sword at his side. All belonged to the Brotherhood. This radical collectivism created a unique bond. In a society where wealth and lineage defined status, the Templars built a world where obedience and faith mattered more than titles or estates. A baron's son might ride beside a man of lesser nobility, each bound by the same vows, subject to the same rules, and judged by the same discipline. This leveling effect gave the order a cohesion rare in medieval institutions, where hierarchy often bred rivalry. Yet poverty did not mean weakness. The paradox of the Templars lay in the contrast between their personal renunciation and their institutional power. Individually, they were sworn beggars. Collectively, they commanded resources greater than many kings. This contradiction unsettled critics, who accused the order of hypocrisy, but it also fascinated admirers, who saw in the Templars a living embodiment of Christ's command to forsake the world while serving a higher purpose. Brotherhood was more than a word. It was survival. Life in the Crusader states was harsh. Heat, disease, and sudden raids claimed lives as often as open battle. Pilgrims relied on escorts not only for protection from bandits, but also for guidance through treacherous terrain. In such conditions, trust among brothers was absolute. A Templar knight could rely on the man beside him, knowing they had shared prayers at dawn and would share danger by dusk. Discipline reinforced this trust. The rule of the order, established under Bernard of Clairvaux's guidance, left no room for selfish ambition. Brothers could not gamble, hunt for pleasure, or even embrace women, not wives, not sisters, not mothers. They were forbidden to kiss any woman at all. These prohibitions shocked some, but they reflected the order's desire to strip away distractions from their sacred mission. Punishment for breaking the rule was severe. A knight who disobeyed could be flogged, stripped of his mantle, or in extreme cases expelled, condemned to live without the order's protection or identity. Expulsion was more than dishonor. It was exile from the only family a knight might truly know. The fear of such disgrace bound men more tightly than chains. This culture of austerity and obedience produced warriors of extraordinary resilience. In battle, they did not break formation to chase glory. They did not retreat unless hopelessly outnumbered. Contemporary observers marveled at their discipline. Muslim chroniclers, often hostile to Christian invaders, still recorded grudging respect for the Templars' fearlessness, noting their refusal to flee even when defeat was certain. The paradox of poverty and power continued to shape their reputation across Christendom. To some, they were saints in armor, humble monks with swords. To others, they were hypocrites hiding vast riches behind vows of renunciation. Both views contained truth. The order's institutional wealth grew rapidly, but individual knights continued to live lives of simplicity and sacrifice. In their daily prayers, they spoke not of glory or gold, but of service, to God, to Christendom, and to one another. Theirs was a brotherhood forged not in bloodline, but in shared faith, shared poverty, and shared peril. It was this solidarity that allowed a handful of knights on borrowed horses to evolve into one of the most formidable organizations of the medieval world. The Temple Mount gave them a home, but poverty gave them identity. Brotherhood gave them strength, and together, these forged a foundation for their astonishing rise in the decades to come. The Templars might have remained a small brotherhood of obscure warriors had it not been for the intervention of one of the most powerful voices of the 12th century, Bernard of Clairvaux. Monk, reformer, preacher, mystic, Bernard was not only the abbot of a new Cistercian monastery, but the moral authority of his age. Kings sought his counsel. Popes listened to his words. His pen and his pulpit could raise armies or silence critics. The fledgling Templar order desperately needed such a champion. Though admired by some for their courage, many clerics and nobles remained suspicious of these warrior monks. How could men sworn to poverty and chastity wield swords and shed blood? Did not Christ preach peace? The contradiction was glaring, and without theological justification, the Templars risked being dismissed as dangerous eccentrics, neither true knights nor true monks. Bernard resolved this tension in a way only he could. In the late 1120s, he wrote a treatise that would become the defining spiritual manifesto of the Templar order, the Laudi Novi Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood. In its pages, Bernard drew a sharp contrast between worldly knights and the new spiritual warriors. Secular knights, he argued, fought for vanity, for land, for the fleeting glory of men. Their armor glittered, their banners boasted, their duels often stemmed from pride. But the Templars, they fought for Christ, for pilgrims, for the defense of the innocent. Their humility, their discipline, their obedience transformed their violence into sanctified service. When a Templar struck down an enemy, Bernard declared it was not murder but Malicide, the killing of evil itself. For the first time, a coherent theological justification existed for the paradox of the warrior monk. This treatise spread quickly across Europe. Nobles, once skeptical, now saw the order as a righteous cause worthy of support. Young knights, hungry for spiritual purpose, found Bernard's words irresistible. His endorsement transformed the Templars from an odd experiment into a movement sanctified by the holiest man of the age. The decisive moment came at the Council of Troyes in January 1129. There, in the presence of church leaders and nobles, Bernard himself argued the case for the Templar order. Under his guidance, a formal rule was drafted, 72 articles blending monastic discipline with martial duty. The rule regulated every detail of life: prayer schedules, clothing, battlefield conduct, punishments. even the length of a knight's beard. It was as much a military manual as a spiritual constitution. The council granted official recognition, and with papal blessings soon after, the Templars became the first true military religious order in Christendom. No longer a handful of men clinging to royal favor, they were now directly under papal protection, answerable to no king, no bishop, only to Rome itself. This autonomy would become one of their greatest strengths, and later, one of their gravest vulnerabilities. Recognition brought visibility, and visibility brought wealth. Across France, England, Flanders, and beyond, nobles donated lands, castles, and revenues. Some did so out of piety, believing that supporting the order was an act of devotion equal to a pilgrimage. Others gave to atone for sins, hoping that such gifts might ease their souls before God's judgment. Whatever the motives, the effect was the same. The order's resources multiplied. The Red Cross, added to their white mantles by papal decree, became a symbol recognized from the shores of Scotland to the deserts of Syria, to where it was not merely to be a knight. It was to be part of a holy brotherhood, a spiritual elite. Recruitment surged, particularly among younger sons of noble families who would inherit no land but sought honor and purpose. For them, the temple offered both family and destiny. Bernard's advocacy also gave the Templars a new role in the imagination of Christendom. They were no longer just protectors of pilgrims. They became the vanguard of the church militant, Christ's chosen warriors, standing between the faithful and the infidel. In sermons, Bernard portrayed them as fearless, their souls armored by faith as surely as their bodies were clad in steel. Yet Bernard's rhetoric was not without consequence. By sanctifying violence under certain conditions, he gave the church a framework to justify war in God's name. The Templars became both the symbol and the instrument of this new theology. Their very existence blurred the lines between monastery and battlefield, between altar and sword. Still, the combination proved irresistible to a medieval world hungry for certainty. The Templars embodied discipline in an age of chaos, faith in an age of doubt, and unity in an age fractured by feudal rivalries. With papal recognition and Bernard's blessing, the order stood poised to grow far beyond its humble origins. Within a single generation, they had moved from obscurity to prominence. What began as 9 poor knights in Jerusalem had become an international brotherhood with papal authority, noble patronage, and a swelling tide of recruits. The groundwork had been laid for their astonishing rise, an ascent that would see them reshape not only the Holy Land, but also the politics, finance, and imagination of all medieval Europe. Bernard had given them legitimacy, the Pope had given them protection, and Christendom had given them its treasure. Now the Templars would show the world what they could do with all three. If the rule and papal recognition gave the Templars legitimacy, it was their castles that gave them power. To understand the rise of the order is to trace the stones of the fortresses they built and defended across the Holy Land and beyond. These were not just walls of mortar and limestone, they were statements of dominance, anchors of survival, and symbols of a new kind of military faith. From the windswept cliffs of the Levantine coast to the rugged hills of Galilee, Templar strongholds dotted the map of Outremer. They were never mere shelters. They were engines of war, carefully positioned to control vital roads, mountain passes, and fertile valleys. A pilgrim might pass beneath their shadow, comforted by the sight of white mantles and red crosses upon the battlements. An enemy, however, would see an unyielding reminder that Christendom had come to stay. One of the earliest and most significant castles was at Gaza, granted to the order in the mid-12th century. It commanded the southern approaches to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, guarding the route from Egypt. To hold Gaza was to block the desert road that could bring enemy armies north. The Templars poured resources into fortifying it, raising walls that would test even the mightiest siege engines. Yet Gaza was only the beginning. Over the decades, the Order became renowned for its fortress architecture. Castles like Safed, Tortosa, and Chateau Pellerin stood as marvels of medieval engineering. Chateau Pellerin, or Pilgrim's Castle, loomed above the coast near Idlit. Built with enormous stone blocks and defended by concentric walls, it was practically impregnable. Chroniclers noted its cisterns, capable of sustaining defenders for years, and its massive towers, bristling with archers ready to rain death upon attackers. These fortresses were more than military tools. They were logistical hubs. Within their thick walls, the Templars stored grain, weapons, and water. They maintained forges, workshops, and stables large enough for hundreds of warhorses. In times of peace, castles hosted pilgrims and dignitaries, serving as way stations along dangerous roads. In times of war, they became bastions of defiance, holding out long after weaker positions had fallen. Strategic placement was everything. The Templars understood the geography of the Holy Land in ways few others did. They learned to read the desert winds, to exploit hills and valleys, to build fortresses on promontories where sightlines stretched for miles. From Croc de Chevaliers, though held mainly by the Hospitallers, to their own commanderies, these warrior monks turned stone into strategy. Their presence reshaped warfare itself. Muslim chroniclers often lamented that while cities could fall, castles manned by Templars held firm. Saladin himself recognized their danger. After the catastrophic defeat of the Crusaders at Hattin in 1187, he moved swiftly not only to capture Jerusalem, but also to dismantle the network of fortresses that could still resist him. One by one, castles fell, but always at terrible cost. Defenders often chose death over surrender, fulfilling the Order's vow to fight to the end. Templar castles were not limited to the east. Across Europe, donors gifted lands and estates where the Order built commanderies, smaller fortifications that served as training grounds, administrative centers, and economic hubs. From England's New Temple in London to the Temple in Paris, these sites connected the farthest corners of Christendom to the defense of the Holy Land. Each castle or preceptory was a link in a chain stretching across 2 continents, all feeding men, money, and supplies eastward. Life within a Templar castle was as regimented as in any monastery. Bells marked the hours of prayer, even during sieges. Knights trained relentlessly, drilling in formation, practicing cavalry charges in courtyards, honing swordplay in shadowed halls. Yet discipline extended beyond combat. Brothers rose before dawn, shared meals in silence, and slept in communal dormitories. The austerity of their lives contrasted sharply with the formidable power of their walls. For common folk, the castles represented safety. Villagers often fled behind their gates during raids, finding refuge under the protection of the Order. For merchants, they guaranteed secure trade routes. For pilgrims, they meant hope, the difference between reaching Jerusalem alive or dying on the road. The Templars became more than warriors. They became landlords, judges, and guardians of entire regions. But power carried its own risks. The very strength of these fortresses bred resentment. Kings and nobles recognized that within their realms, the Templars held castles loyal not to them but to the Pope. This independence was both their shield and their eventual undoing. While castles anchored the Order's influence, they also fueled suspicion that the warrior monks were a kingdom within kingdoms. Still, for nearly 2 centuries, these fortresses stood as the backbone of the Crusader states. Even as Jerusalem itself changed hands, as kings rose and fell, the white-mantled knights kept watch from their battlements. In the glow of dawn, banners bearing the Red Cross snapped in the desert wind, proclaiming that Christendom still endured. The story of the Templars cannot be told without their castles. They were the visible expression of invisible vows, the stone embodiment of faith turned into power. Each fortress was a sermon in limestone: obedience, sacrifice, vigilance, and defiance. And as long as they stood, so too did the legend of the warrior monks who called them home. The Knights Templar were never meant to be a purely symbolic order. Their white mantles and red crosses were not for ceremony alone. They were for war. From the mid-12th century onward, Templar Knights became the sharp edge of the crusading enterprise, present at nearly every major battle in the Holy Land. Their reputation for discipline, ferocity, and refusal to retreat turned them into both legends and martyrs. Their baptism of fire came at the siege of Ascalon in 1153, one of the last Muslim strongholds threatening the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Under Grand Master Bernard de Tremolay, the Templars charged through a breach in the walls, hoping to seize the city. Accounts differ. Some chroniclers accuse them of recklessness, others of courage beyond compare. Whatever the truth, the outcome was grim. Bernard and 40 knights were cut off and killed, their bodies displayed from the ramparts. Though a disaster for the order, it sealed their reputation for fearless commitment. They would lead, even into death, but not all their battles ended in tragedy. In 1177, at Montgassard, the Templars helped achieve one of the most astonishing victories of the Crusader era. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the leper king, barely able to ride, faced Saladin's army of some 26,000 men with barely 600 knights, including just 80 Templars. Against all odds, the Christian army struck by surprise. The Templars spearheaded the charge, smashing into Saladin's unprepared columns. Panic spread, and by sunset, Saladin's force was shattered, thousands cut down as they fled. Chroniclers hailed it as divine intervention, but it was discipline and daring, hallmarks of the Templars, that turned the tide. Yet fate could be cruel. Barely a decade later came the Battle of Hattin in 1187, the catastrophe that doomed the Kingdom of Jerusalem. King Guy of Lusignan, against a council of seasoned commanders, including Templar leaders, marched his army across arid plains in midsummer with little water. Trapped and exhausted, the Crusaders faced annihilation. The Templars, bound by their vow never to retreat, launched desperate charges against Saladin's encirclement, white mantles vanishing in waves of blood and dust. Almost all perished. Those captured met no ransom. Saladin ordered hundreds of Templars executed, their courage too dangerous to be allowed to live. The loss of so many seasoned knights crippled Christian defense. The fall of Jerusalem soon followed, yet the Templars endured. Their discipline, wealth, and international recruitment allowed them to recover when secular armies dissolved. When Richard the Lionheart launched the Third Crusade, Templars fought at his side. Chroniclers record Richard's reliance on their advice, their reconnaissance, and their financial network, which sustained his army when royal treasuries ran dry. At the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, Richard placed Templar knights at the vanguard of his army, where they held formation under relentless harassment until he gave the order to charge, at which point the disciplined assault broke Saladin's cavalry. The Templars' influence extended beyond the battlefield. Their castles served as staging grounds, their ships ferried troops and supplies, and their treasury funded campaigns. While kings returned to Europe, the Templars remained, garrisoning the shrinking territories of Outremer year after year. They became the backbone of the crusading presence, the permanent guardians of Christendom's eastern frontier. But permanence came at a price. Their uncompromising stance sometimes clashed with secular rulers seeking diplomatic compromise. Where kings might negotiate truces with Muslim leaders, Templar Grand Masters often insisted on continued resistance. This rigidity won them admiration from zealots, but bred tension with pragmatists who saw diplomacy as the only path to survival. The Fifth and Sixth Crusades revealed these tensions. In Egypt, Templar contingents fought bravely, But poor coordination with European leaders led to disastrous retreats. When Emperor Frederick II later secured Jerusalem through negotiation rather than war, the Templars viewed the arrangement with suspicion, unwilling to trust what could not be won by the sword. Their doubts proved justified when the city was lost again within a decade. Even in decline, the order fought to the end. In 1291, at Acre, the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, Templars held their fortress long after the city had fallen. Grand Master William of Beaujeu fought until mortally wounded, refusing to abandon the walls. Survivors retreated to Cyprus, where the order regrouped, launching raids in desperate hope of reclaiming the coast. Their final outpost, a tiny island near Syria, fell in 1303. Surrounded, the brothers fought to the last man. On the battlefield, the Templars embodied contradictions. They were monks who prayed at dawn and killed by noon. They embraced poverty, yet commanded immense resources. They swore obedience, and yet held immense autonomy. Their discipline made them formidable, but their inflexibility sometimes proved fatal. For nearly 2 centuries, the sight of their red cross sent shivers through enemies and inspired awe among allies. Whether at Montcassard's triumph, Hatine's disaster, or Acre's last stand, the Templars became more than soldiers. They became symbols of courage, of sacrifice, and of the terrible price of holy war. The fall of Acre in 1291 was more than the loss of a city. It was the end of an era. For nearly 2 centuries, the Crusader states had stood as fragile outposts of Latin Christendom in the East. With Acre's walls reduced to rubble and its streets drowned in blood, the dream of a Christian Jerusalem slipped permanently into memory. For the Templars, this catastrophe posed a question more dangerous than any Muslim adversary. Without the Holy Land, what was their purpose? The decline had begun long before Acre's final siege. After the crushing defeat at Hatine in 1187 and the subsequent loss of Jerusalem, Christian holdings in the east were reduced to narrow strips of coastal territory. These enclaves lacked the fertile hinterlands that once supported armies and trade. They were dependent on supplies and reinforcements from Europe, but enthusiasm for crusading had waned. Where the First Crusade had rallied thousands with the cry of Deus Vult, later calls for holy war met with indifference, or worse, political manipulation. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, diverted to Constantinople, epitomized this drift. Instead of striking at the Muslim powers, threatening the Levant, Western armies sacked a Christian capital, permanently fracturing relations between East and West. For the Templars, who remained on the frontiers, the diversion was a bitter betrayal. They held castles, patrolled roads, and guarded pilgrims, while Europe's knights turned their swords on fellow Christians. Meanwhile, new powers rose in the Islamic world. The Ayyubid dynasty founded by Saladin gave way to the Mamluks, hardened warriors of slave origin who built a formidable state in Egypt. Under sultans like Baybars and Al-Ashraf Khalil, the Mamluks launched systematic campaigns against the remaining Crusader fortresses. Unlike earlier Muslim rulers, who often tolerated truces, the Mamluks pursued total victory. Step by step, castle by castle, they dismantled the Crusader presence. Even mighty strongholds like Safed and Tortosa eventually fell to their relentless sieges. The Templars fought desperately, but numbers were never on their side. A vow-bound brotherhood of a few thousand could not match the armies of a centralized and disciplined sultanate. Their castles bought time, but not salvation. In 1289, the fall of Tripoli left Acre isolated. 2 years later, the inevitable came. The Templars and Hospitallers fought street by street, tower by tower, until their Grand Master William of Beaujeu fell defending a breach. Survivors retreated to the Templar fortress within the city, holding long enough for civilians to escape by sea. When the fortress collapsed under bombardment, the Holy Land was lost forever. Exile brought crisis. The Templars retreated first to Cyprus, from which they launched raids on the Syrian coast. But the days of Christian dominion in the Levant were over. Their castles lay in ruins, their mission undone. The Hospitallers adapted, transforming themselves into a maritime power, soon to dominate Rhodes and Malta. The Templars, however, struggled to redefine themselves. They still commanded vast wealth and estates across Europe, but without the Holy Land, their purpose seemed unclear. This was a dangerous position. Medieval society tolerated the privileges of religious orders only when those privileges served obvious spiritual or military ends. The Templars had once justified their autonomy, their tax exemptions, and their direct subordination to the Pope by pointing to the crucible of Outremer. But now, they appeared as a wealthy order of knights without a battlefield. To kings hungry for revenue, they looked less like guardians of Christendom and more like a prize ripe for seizure. Criticism mounted. Some whispered that the order had grown soft, more concerned with managing estates and banking networks than fighting for Christ. Others accused them of arrogance, pointing to their independence from local rulers. Rivals like the Hospitallers pressed for a merger, arguing that one united military order could better serve Christendom. The Templars resisted fiercely, clinging to their identity, but resistance only deepened suspicion. Internally, morale wavered. For generations, knights had taken vows expecting to fight and die in the East. Now, many spent their days overseeing farms in France or England, collecting rents and managing accounts. Though the rules still governed their lives, the fire of holy war was harder to sustain when the Holy Land itself was gone. Yet the order was not without vision. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, elected in 1292, proposed ambitious plans for a new crusade. He traveled across Europe seeking support, presenting detailed memoranda to monarchs and popes. But times had changed. Kings preferred to fight one another over dynastic disputes rather than expend treasure on distant wars. Popes, weakened by political entanglements, offered little more than words. De Molay's pleas fell largely on deaf ears. The stage was set for disaster. The Templars remained wealthy, disciplined, and international, but rootless. Their castles were gone, their mission questioned, their enemies multiplying. They had survived 2 centuries of desert wars, only to face a new battlefield far more treacherous: the courts and councils of Europe itself. And in France, a king named Philip IV was watching closely. His coffers empty, his ambitions vast. He saw in the Templars not holy warriors but rivals, and an opportunity. The dawn of Friday, October 13th, 1307, broke cold over Paris. Few could have guessed that before nightfall, one of the most powerful institutions in Christendom would be shattered. In a meticulously planned operation, agents of King Philip IV of France moved across the kingdom, armed with sealed orders. Their targets were not foreign enemies or rebellious lords, but the very men who had once been hailed as Christ's chosen warriors, the Knights Templar. By evening, hundreds of Templars, including Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were in chains. Their properties were seized, their reputations blackened, their fate sealed. The greatest military religious order of the Middle Ages had fallen not to Saracen swords, but to European politics and royal greed. The roots of this betrayal lay in Philip IV himself. Nicknamed Philip the Fair for his striking appearance, he was anything but fair in policy. His endless wars with England and Flanders had bankrupted France. Desperate for revenue, he debased the currency, taxed clergy, and expelled Jews to seize their wealth. None of it was enough. The Templars, with their vast estates, international banking network, and reputation for secrecy, presented the perfect target. Philip had once been a client of the order, storing treasures in their Paris temple and borrowing heavily to fund his wars. But dependence bred resentment. To a king bent on centralizing authority, the Templars' independence. Answering only to the Pope was intolerable. Worse, their wealth and fortress in the heart of Paris stood as a reminder that another power operated within his kingdom, immune to royal control. To destroy them, Philip needed more than soldiers. He needed a story. And so came the accusations: heresy, idolatry, blasphemy. The charges were sensational, that new initiates were forced to spit on the cross, deny Christ, kiss one another in obscene ways, even worship a mysterious head called Baphomet. To medieval ears, such claims were horrifying. To modern ones, they sound like grotesque fabrications. But in an age of fear, rumor was as deadly as any weapon. Torture made the rumors real. In dungeons across France, Templar knights were stretched, burned, and broken until they confessed to anything their interrogators demanded. Jacques de Molay himself, weary from the rack, admitted to denying Christ during initiation. His confession was broadcast across Europe as proof of the order's corruption. Later, he recanted, but the damage was done. The Pope, Clement V, was caught in an impossible bind. French by birth, indebted to Philip for his election, and newly installed in Avignon, he lacked the strength to resist. Officially, the Templars were a papal order, protected by Rome. In practice, Clement was forced to follow Philip's lead. He issued bulls extending the arrests across Christendom, though in most regions, England, Aragon, Portugal, Germany, investigations found little evidence. Only in France, under torture, did confessions flow. The trials dragged on for years. Some brothers clung to their innocence, only to be branded relapsed heretics and burned alive. Others confessed under duress, hoping for mercy. The order's vast properties were officially transferred to the Hospitallers. But in France, much of the treasure vanished into Philip's coffers. Justice was not the goal, profit was. The final act came in March 1314. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Templars, was led to the square before Notre Dame in Paris to hear his sentence, life imprisonment. But in a stunning reversal, he stood tall and proclaimed the order's innocence, declaring his earlier confessions false, forced by torture. His courage sealed his fate. Philip ordered him and fellow leader Geoffrey de Charny burned at the stake that very evening. Witnesses claimed de Molay died with dignity, calling on God to judge his persecutors. Legend holds that he cursed both Philip and Clement, summoning them before God within a year. Remarkably, both men did die within months, Clement in April, Philip in November. To contemporaries, it seemed divine justice had answered the Grand Master's last words. With their leaders dead, their property seized, and their rule suppressed by papal decree at the Council of Vienne in 1312. The Templars as an institution ceased to exist, yet their memory refused to die. Instead, it grew larger, darker, more mysterious. Whispers spread of hidden treasures spirited away before the arrests, of knights who escaped to Scotland or Switzerland, of secret survival disguised under new banners. What is certain is that the Templars had been destroyed not by battlefield defeat, but by conspiracy, greed, and betrayal from the very rulers they had once defended. Their downfall revealed the ruthless power of kings in an age when money and politics could silence even the most sanctified brotherhood. The warrior monks who had stood unbroken before Saracen armies fell instead to parchment, seals, and firewood. Yet in their ashes, a legend was born. When Jacques de Molay's ashes cooled on the Isle de la Cite in March 1314, the Order of the Temple ceased to exist as an institution. Yet paradoxically, its power had only begun to grow. The Templars, once flesh and blood warriors, became symbols. Their white mantles vanished from the battlefield, but in imagination and memory, they marched on. In the immediate aftermath, their legacy took divergent paths across Europe. In France, King Philip's agents swiftly absorbed their estates. The wealth he had coveted so long poured into royal treasuries. Though much simply disappeared, sparking rumors of hidden treasure. In England and Iberia, the papal decree transferring Templar properties to the Hospitallers was more faithfully executed. Yet even there, locals whispered that the Knights had concealed relics, archives, and gold before surrendering. The very efficiency of the arrests, the sudden sweep on October 13th, 1307, gave birth to suspicion. How could such a vast order leave so little behind? Portugal found a creative solution. King Denis resisted dissolving the Templars entirely, instead refounding them as the Order of Christ in 1319. With papal approval, the same men, lands, and traditions continued under a new name. This reborn order would later play a decisive role in the Age of Discovery, when Prince Henry the Navigator sent caravels into the Atlantic and along the African coast. They sailed under the Crimson Cross of the Templars, now reborn as explorers rather than crusaders. In this sense, the Templar mission never ended. It simply shifted from Holy Land to open sea. Elsewhere, the traces of the Templars became more spectral. In Scotland, legends claim fugitive knights aided Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314, turning the tide against England. Though evidence is thin, the tale persists, binding Templar mystique to Scottish identity and, later, to Freemasonry. From the 18th century onward, Masonic lodges adopted Templar titles, rituals, and symbols, claiming secret descent from the warrior monks. Whether true or not, the association cemented the Templars as guardians of hidden wisdom in the Western imagination. The Templars also left lasting marks on architecture and finance. Their round churches, modeled on Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre, still stand in cities like London, Paris, and Tomar. Their fortresses, from Syria's Croc de Chevaliers to Portugal's Convento de Cristo, remain as stone witnesses to their discipline and ambition. In finance, their innovations, letters of credit, secure deposits, international transfers, prefigured modern banking. What kings once called secrets of the temple became the foundation of European commerce. But perhaps their greatest legacy is myth. Within decades of their fall, stories spread that the Templars had guarded the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or secret knowledge passed from Solomon's temple itself. Their suppression seemed too shocking, too unjust, to be explained by greed alone. People searched for deeper reasons, imagining the Templars as keepers of mysteries too dangerous for kings or popes to allow. The legend of de Molay's curse only fed this mystique. Chroniclers recorded that as the flames consumed him, the Grand Master summoned King Philip and Pope Clement to divine judgment within the year. When both men died within months, Clement of illness, Philip from a hunting accident, many saw divine vengeance fulfilled. This tale transformed the Templars from victims into martyrs, and their persecutors into damned men haunted by prophecy. In later centuries, romanticism and conspiracy would entwine around their memory. Writers like Sir Walter Scott made them villains or heroes in novels of medieval chivalry. Occultists wove them into esoteric traditions. Modern pop culture, from Indiana Jones to the Da Vinci Code to Assassin's Creed, resurrected them as symbols of hidden power. Few medieval orders left such a broad imprint on imagination. Yet beyond myth, the Templar story reveals something timeless. It is a tale of ideals corrupted by power, of loyalty betrayed by politics, of how institutions rise through discipline but fall to envy and fear. Their discipline and courage made them indispensable in the Crusades. Their wealth and autonomy made them intolerable to kings. Their vows bound them to a mission that history itself rendered obsolete. And so the paradox endures. The Templars lost everything: castles, lands, brothers, even their very name. Yet in losing, they gained immortality. Their memory haunts ruins, symbols, and stories across centuries, embodying both the noblest and darkest possibilities of human ambition. from 9 knights in Jerusalem to global financiers to heretics burned at the stake. The arc of the Templars is one of history's most compelling tragedies. Their legacy is not simply military or financial. It is cultural, spiritual, and symbolic. They remind us that institutions are fragile, but myths endure. Long after their banners were torn down, the red cross of the temple still flies, not on battlefields, but in minds and imaginations, where the warrior monks remain eternal. The year 1314 should have been the end of the Templars. Their Grand Master burned, their rule dissolved, their wealth seized. Yet almost immediately, whispers began to circulate. Perhaps the knights had not died at all. Perhaps they had escaped. Perhaps they had taken their greatest secrets with them. One of the most enduring legends was that of the Templar treasure. Chroniclers noted with surprise how little gold was actually seized from the Paris Temple in 1307. For an order that had managed royal treasuries and financed crusades, this absence seemed suspicious. Rumors spread that on the eve of the arrests, wagons had slipped away under cover of darkness, carrying chests of gold, relics, and documents to an unknown destination. Some said the treasure was hidden in the remote strongholds of Languedoc. Others believed it sailed from La Rochelle, the Templar port, to Scotland or beyond. In later centuries, the myth migrated to new worlds: Oak Island in Nova Scotia, America's deserts, even the Caribbean. The absence of proof only fueled imagination. Each generation placed a treasure in its own distant frontier, always just out of reach. Equally powerful were tales of Templar survival. In Iberia, the transformation of the order into the Portuguese Order of Christ provided a plausible line of continuity. In Spain, some former brothers joined the orders of Calatrava or Montesa. These official transitions blurred into rumor that the Templars had never vanished, only changed names. Scotland, too, became fertile ground for myth. When Robert the Bruce was excommunicated for killing a rival before the altar, he was cut off from official crusading orders. According to legend, fugitive Templars found sanctuary in his kingdom. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, just months after the Molay's execution, stories claim that mysterious knights charged into the fray, turning the tide against England. Whether true or not, the tale bound Templar memory to Scottish independence and later fed into Masonic lore. Then came the mystery of Baphomet. The idol the Templars were accused of worshipping became an enduring enigma. Was it a corruption of Muhammad, meant to smear them as Muslim sympathizers? A Gnostic symbol? A misunderstood relic? Later occultists seized on the term, transforming Baphomet into a dark figure of hidden wisdom, forever linking the Templars to esoteric traditions. Perhaps the most famous survival myth tied the Templars to the Holy Grail. From the 12th century onward, Grail romances flourished in Europe. By the time of their suppression, it was easy for storytellers to imagine that the guardians of the temple had also guarded the Grail itself. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, the guardians of the Grail are knights called the Templisen, a tantalizing echo of the Templars. Later writers made the link explicit. The Grail had been their secret all along. These stories mattered not because they were true, but because they filled a void. People could not accept that an order so powerful, so disciplined, had simply been erased. Legends offered a different answer, that the Templars had slipped into the shadows, carrying their secrets forward. The treasure, the Grail, Baphomet, Bannockburn. Each tale expressed the same conviction, that the Templars were too extraordinary to die. Even their suppression seemed to prove their significance. For why would kings and popes conspire to destroy them unless they had guarded something worth killing for? By the 15th century, whispers of Templar survival merged with the rise of esoteric brotherhoods. Groups claiming hidden knowledge traced their lineage to the temple. Secret rites, symbols, and degrees echoed medieval initiation rumors. The Templars had become less a historical order than a template for secrecy, guardianship, and mystery. Modern historians can strip away much of the myth. No hidden grail has been found, no treasure unearthed, no document proving survival. Yet the persistence of these legends is itself a form of legacy. The Templars endure not because of what they truly hid, but because of what people imagined they might have. In the centuries after their fall, their absence became more powerful than their presence had ever been. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe had changed beyond recognition. The Crusades were long over, the castles of Outremer stood in ruins, and few remembered the precise charges that had destroyed the Templars. Yet their name had not vanished. Instead, it had resurfaced in unexpected places, lodges, rituals, and whispered societies claiming to guard secret wisdom. The Templars, dead in history, were reborn in myth. The key link was Freemasonry, emerging in early modern England as a fraternity of stonemasons and gentlemen. Masonry quickly spread across Europe. Its lodges blended craft traditions with allegory, ritual, and a fascination for ancient orders. Among these, none carried more allure than the Knights Templar. By the mid-18th century, Masonic systems in France and Germany had begun to incorporate Templar degrees, higher ranks that claimed descent from the suppressed order. The idea was simple but electrifying. The Templars had not been destroyed, only driven underground, preserving their rights in secrecy until they could reemerge. Initiates to these degrees were told they were continuing the Brotherhood's mission, guarding wisdom that kings and popes had once feared. The timing was no accident. Europe was an age of enlightenment, but also of romantic fascination with chivalry, mystery, and hidden truth. The Templars, monks, warriors, martyrs, heretics, victims of injustice, offered the perfect vessel for these longings. Their dramatic suppression in 1307 seemed to invite conspiracy theories. Their rumored treasures and idols promised secrets yet undiscovered. To bind them to Masonry gave the fraternity historical depth and mystique. One of the most influential systems was the strict observance founded in Germany in the mid-1700s. Its leaders claimed direct continuation from surviving Templars, asserting that the order had secretly guided Masonry for centuries. Members donned Templar-style regalia, swore knightly vows, and envisioned themselves as heirs to a crusading brotherhood. Though historians exposed these claims as inventions, the romantic appeal proved irresistible. Even in Scotland, where legends of Bannockburn already tied the Templars to national myth, Masonic writers emphasized supposed links. Lodges proudly adopted Templar titles, incorporating red crosses and swords into their rituals. The Grand Master of Scotland was sometimes styled a successor to Jacques de Molay himself. Not all Masons embraced these claims. Some criticized them as fanciful, undermining the fraternity's universal ideals with sectarian legends. Yet the Templar current within Masonry never disappeared. To this day, many branches of Freemasonry, especially the Knights Templar orders of chivalric Masonry, draw heavily on the imagery and symbolism of the medieval order, even if historical continuity remains doubtful. Beyond Masonry, the Templars infiltrated European imagination in subtler ways. Secret societies of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Illuminati, Rosicrucians, and countless minor brotherhoods, borrowed freely from Templar lore. To claim descent from the warrior monks was to invoke both the authority of history and the thrill of forbidden knowledge. This transformation of the Templars into esoteric archetypes reveals a fascinating paradox. The medieval order had been brutally suppressed, accused of blasphemy and heresy. Yet in later centuries, precisely those accusations, their supposed worship of Baphomet, their secret initiations, their hidden treasure, were reimagined as proof that they had possessed profound mysteries worth killing for. What had been slander in 1307 became allure in 1707. Romanticism in the 19th century amplified this trend. Writers and artists, enthralled by ruined castles and tales of lost chivalry, cast the Templars as tragic heroes. Painters depicted Jacques de Molay's martyrdom. Novelists wove them into plots of hidden wisdom. Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe presented Templars as both villainous and alluring, cementing their place in popular fiction. By the time modern secret societies and fraternities expanded across Europe and the Americas, the Templars had become a universal shorthand for ancient secrecy and brotherhood. Whether invoked as noble martyrs, dangerous conspirators, or custodians of forbidden knowledge, they filled the cultural imagination with mystery. And so, centuries after their downfall, the Templars had achieved what no king or pope could have foreseen. They had become eternal, not as soldiers in white mantles charging across Levantine plains, but as symbols woven into the fabric of Western esotericism. Their swords had rusted, their castles fallen, their treasuries emptied. But in ritual halls lit by candlelight, men whispered oaths in their name, imagining themselves heirs to a lineage that death and fire could not erase. The Templars, it seemed, had survived after all, if not in fact, then in faith, story, and symbol. By the Renaissance, the memory of the Knights Templar had shifted from a raw wound to a subject of fascination. Their downfall, once political scandal, had grown into legend. Scholars, poets, and statesmen look back on their suppression not only as history, but as allegory. An episode that revealed the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of justice, and the mysteries buried beneath official narratives. In the 15th and 16th centuries, humanist historians began to revisit the Templar trials. With access to chronicles and legal documents, they recognized how much of the case against the order relied on torture and political pressure. Early voices suggested what later became obvious, that the knights had been victims of royal greed. Their rehabilitation began quietly, as chroniclers reframed them not as heretics, but as martyrs to ambition. At the same time, Renaissance curiosity gave new life to the mystical rumors that had surrounded them. Europe's appetite for hidden knowledge, alchemy, astrology, Kabbalah, found in the Templars a perfect canvas. Their secret initiation rites, once condemned, were now imagined as veils concealing ancient wisdom. The charge of idol worship evolved into speculation about preserved relics or esoteric teachings passed from antiquity. Even the enigmatic name Baphomet was reinterpreted through the lens of occult philosophy. No longer a slur, but a cipher. Artists, too, rediscovered the Templars. In illuminated manuscripts, frescoes, and epic poems, they were cast as symbols of both glory and tragedy. Painters depicted Jacques de Molay's death as heroic martyrdom, flames licking his unbowed figure. Poets mourned the fall of a once noble order. Their story resonated with Renaissance ideals of honor, betrayal, and the rise and fall of great men. By the 17th century, the Enlightenment reframed the Templars once again. Philosophers and political writers saw in their suppression a parable about the abuse of power. Voltaire, ever skeptical of church authority, pointed to the Templars as evidence of how superstition and politics combined to destroy innocence. For thinkers committed to reason and liberty, the Knights were not mystical survivors, but victims of tyranny. Their trial became a cautionary tale of state power crushing dissent. This rationalist reading did not erase the mystical one. Rather, both streams flourished side by side. Some Enlightenment writers dismissed the Grail and treasure myths as fantasy. Others embraced them, weaving the Templars into speculative histories that connected them with Druids, Egyptians, or lost Atlanteans. The absence of hard evidence was, paradoxically, what allowed their story to expand without limit. Political movements also found value in the Templar name. In a Europe fractured by wars of religion and rising nationalism, the order's image could be molded to fit many causes. French monarchists painted them as loyal martyrs, destroyed by an overreaching king. Revolutionaries later cast them as symbols of resistance against oppression. Secret societies and lodges drew on their legacy to claim historical depth, even as historians debated their actual past. The calendar date of October 13th, 1307, gained sinister resonance. Superstition grew that Friday the 13th was unlucky, tied forever to the day the Templars were betrayed. Whether coincidence or invention, the association endured, embedding their fall in cultural memory long after details had been forgotten. By the late Enlightenment, the Templars were everywhere, in political tracts, in Masonic halls, in paintings, and in whispered conspiracy theories. They were no longer simply knights who had fought at Acre or Montgassard. They had become a mirror. To rationalists, they reflected injustice. To mystics, they reflected hidden wisdom. To patriots, they reflected loyalty. To conspiracists, they reflected secret survival. This multiplicity of meanings ensured that the Templars could never fade. Unlike other medieval orders, whose memory remained confined to archives, the Templars lived on in argument, art, and imagination. Their suppression had given them more afterlife than victory ever could. Thus, by the dawn of the modern age, they had ceased to be a medieval institution and had become instead a cultural symbol, one endlessly adaptable, shaped as much by the needs of later centuries as by the truth of their own. The 19th century was the golden age of Templar myth-making, where the Renaissance had studied them and the Enlightenment had debated them. Romanticism embraced them with passion. Writers, artists, and poets saw in the Templars not just a historical order, but an irresistible blend of tragedy, mystery, and grandeur. Their story fit perfectly into an age fascinated by ruins, medieval chivalry, and the haunting echoes of the past. At the heart of this transformation was Sir Walter Scott. His 1819 novel Ivanhoe introduced generations of readers to a vivid, if fictionalized, vision of the Templars. Scott's antagonist, Brian de Bois Guilbert, embodied both the allure and the danger of the order. Proud, skilled, yet corrupted by ambition and passion. In his pages, the Templars became not dry relics of crusading history, but living characters, filled with fire and contradiction. Ivanhoe was wildly popular, shaping how millions understood the Middle Ages. Other authors followed. Alexander Dumas wove Templar intrigue into his sprawling tales, giving them the aura of conspirators operating behind the curtain of history. Victor Hugo invoked them in his meditations on justice and tyranny. Jules Michelet, the great French historian, painted them as victims of despotism, writing with empathy for their downfall. To romantic minds, Jacques de Molay at the stake became a symbol of martyrdom, a lone figure defying kings and popes with his last breath. Painters, too, joined a revival. Dramatic canvases depicted knights in white mantles, standing among the ruins of Jerusalem or marching to their doom in Paris. Sculptors carved images of fallen warriors, noble in defeat. The ruins of Templar churches and castles across Europe became sites of pilgrimage for travelers enchanted by the romance of decay. Where Enlightenment writers had seen cautionary tales, romantics saw tragic beauty. The Grail legends also flourished in this era, and the Templars became their natural guardians. Wagner's Parsifal wove together Grail mysticism with echoes of knightly brotherhoods. Writers speculated that the Grail had been preserved by the Templars, carried from Jerusalem to secret refuges in Europe. Though based more on imagination than evidence, these connections fused into popular culture, inseparable from the Order's legacy. At the same time, Romantic nationalism found uses for the Templars. In France, they were seen as victims of royal tyranny, their suppression symbolic of the struggle against absolutism. In Scotland, legends of Templar aid at Bannockburn resurfaced, dovetailing with a growing sense of Scottish identity. In Portugal, the Order of Christ was celebrated as the seed of maritime glory. Each nation found in the Templars a mirror for its own aspirations. Not all portrayals were flattering. Some writers cast them as villains, secretive, corrupt, power-hungry. Gothic novels played with the idea of Dark Templar rites hidden in ruined chapels, of knights who had turned to forbidden practices. The ambiguity was part of their power. They could be heroes or monsters, martyrs or conspirators. Their suppression, mysterious and violent, made them endlessly adaptable. Romanticism thrived on paradox, and the Templars embodied it. They were monks who fought like warriors, holy men accused of heresy, defenders of Christendom destroyed by Christians. They could be draped in purity or tainted with sin, exalted or damned. That duality gave artists and writers the freedom to shape them for whatever story they wished to tell. By the end of the 19th century, the Templars had fully escaped the confines of history. They lived in novels, operas, paintings, folklore, and nationalist myths. Their real past, of dusty preceptories, financial ledgers, and hard-fought sieges, mattered less than the legend. For Romantics, that legend was irresistible, a tale of noble warriors betrayed, of secrets buried, of ruins whispering in twilight. And in shaping them so vividly, Romanticism ensured that the Templars would never again fade into obscurity. From then on, they belonged as much to imagination as to scholarship, knights forever walking the line between history and myth. As the 19th century progressed, fascination with the Templars took on a darker, more conspiratorial hue. No longer content with romantic tales of knights and ruins, writers and secret societies began to imagine the Templars as architects of hidden power. Their abrupt suppression, their missing treasure, and the mysterious charges of heresy became fertile ground for speculation. One of the most influential sources was the French cleric Abbé Beryl, whose writings after the French Revolution suggested that Masonic lodges, and by extension, their supposed Templar ancestors, were behind revolutionary upheavals. The idea that the Templars had survived underground, plotting vengeance against kings and popes, found eager audiences in an era terrified of secret societies. By the mid-1800s, new occult movements embraced the Templar name. The Rosicrucians, the Illuminati, and other esoteric brotherhoods borrowed Templar imagery to give their rituals historical gravitas. In France, secret orders like the Ordre du Temple claimed direct descent from Jacques de Molay, crowning successor Grand Masters who pledged to carry forward his cause. While historians dismissed these claims as inventions, they demonstrated how powerful the Templar brand had become for anyone seeking mystique. The most influential of these reinventions came from Eliphas Levi, the French occultist who gave new life to the figure of Baphomet. In his 1856 work Dogme et Ritual de la Haute Magie, Levi drew the now iconic image of a horned, winged figure with goat's head and human body. Though he never claimed it was historically linked to the Templars, popular imagination fused Levi's Baphomet with the medieval accusations. Suddenly, the knights were not just fallen warriors, they were keepers of occult knowledge, guardians of a pagan or Gnostic secret too dangerous for the medieval church to tolerate. Meanwhile, pseudo-historians spun elaborate theories, connecting the Templars to everything from ancient Egypt to the builders of the pyramids. Some claimed they had discovered America before Columbus, sailing west with their hidden treasure. Others insisted they had preserved the bloodline of Christ, protecting a secret lineage suppressed by the church. Each theory blended fragments of history with leaps of imagination, always anchored in the mystery of their destruction. Politically, the Templars were invoked by both sides. Reactionaries painted them as dark conspirators whose survival fueled revolutions. Radicals celebrated them as victims of tyranny, a secret brotherhood waiting to bring justice. In every case, they were more symbol than fact, vessels into which each movement poured its own anxieties and hopes. By the late 19th century, these ideas coalesced into sprawling grand conspiracy theories. Some writers argued that the Templars had become the invisible hand behind world events, their descendants manipulating monarchies, revolutions, and even empires. They were accused of founding Freemasonry, of plotting within the Vatican, of pulling strings from shadows. At the same time, Romantic nationalism continued to exploit their memory. In Portugal, the Order of Christ was celebrated as the true heir of the Temple, fueling national pride in the Age of Discovery. In France, Templar ruins became sites of patriotic pilgrimage, especially for those disillusioned with monarchy and church alike. The knight's fate could symbolize almost anything: resistance to tyranny, betrayal by power, or the endurance of secret wisdom. Conspiracy theories thrive precisely because the Templars had ended in silence. No final chronicle, no clear verdict, only torture-forced confessions and sudden executions. Into that silence, imagination poured. The missing treasure at La Rochelle, the mysterious idol, the whispered curse of Jacques de Molay, all invited questions without answers. And in a century addicted to secret plots and hidden societies, the Templars became the perfect protagonists. By 1900, they were no longer just a medieval order. They were a universal symbol of conspiracy itself, whether in occult lodges, political tracts, or popular fiction. The Templars stood as proof that history might conceal deeper truths. Their real story had ended in flames on a Parisian island, but in the minds of millions, they had never died. They had simply gone underground, waiting, watching, plotting, guarding. The 20th century brought new upheavals, 2 world wars, the collapse of empires, the rise of nationalism and ideology. Amid this turbulence, the Templars resurfaced once more, their image reshaped to serve political agendas, religious debates, and national myths. They were no longer just medieval warriors or romantic heroes. They had become a cultural weapon, invoked to inspire, to warn, or to manipulate. In Portugal, the legacy of the Order of Christ, already celebrated during the Age of Discovery, was elevated into a symbol of national destiny. Under the dictatorship of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, the Red Cross of the Templars was revived as a patriotic emblem. It adorned coins, stamps, and military insignia, linking modern Portugal with its medieval and maritime past. For Salazar, the Templar heritage embodied discipline, Catholic faith, and loyalty to authority, all qualities he wished to project onto his regime. Elsewhere, nationalist movements also seized upon the Templar image. In France, some conservative Catholics saw the order as martyrs destroyed by royal greed, symbols of the Church's victimhood. Others, particularly far-right groups, used them as icons of Western defense against supposed enemies of European identity. The paradox was striking. The same knights could be painted as champions of faith, as victims of tyranny, or as defenders of racial purity, depending on who invoked them. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, struggled with their memory. In 2007, the Vatican quietly released documents from the Shinnon parchment, long hidden in the archives. These revealed that Pope Clement V had secretly absolved the Templars of heresy, even as he suppressed them under pressure from Philip IV. The revelation came centuries too late to save them, but it reshaped their legacy. For many, it proved that the knights had been victims of politics, not corruption. The Church had once doubted. Now it offered belated vindication. In popular imagination, the Templars also became entangled with apocalyptic and millenarian movements. Some fringe Christian groups claimed they had preserved true faith outside of corrupt institutions, linking them to end times prophecy. Occult revivalists, meanwhile, imagined them as guardians of ancient wisdom, Atlantean secrets, Grail mysteries, or hidden scriptures. Their white mantles appeared in rituals of Neo-Templar orders across Europe and the Americas, organizations blending spiritualism, esotericism, and nationalism. The world wars gave their image new resonance. In France, Soldiers marching to the front sometimes invoked the Templars as models of discipline and sacrifice. In Germany, however, darker uses emerged. Nazi ideologues, obsessed with pseudo-history and Aryan myths, twisted the Templar legacy to fit their racial worldview. While some Nazi leaders despised the medieval church, others admired the Templars as proto-SS, an elite order combining martial skill and secret initiation. Himmler's SS rituals at Wilsburg Castle bore striking parallels to romanticized visions of Templar chapters, though distorted into grotesque parody. In the Cold War, Templar myths reappeared in unexpected ways. Conspiracy theorists claimed that secret Templar-descended lodges were manipulating politics behind the scenes, pulling strings in both East and West. Anti-Masonic propaganda often folded the Templars into broader narratives of hidden elites. Once again, the Knights served as a canvas for fears about invisible power. Yet not all 20th century uses were sinister. In literature and cinema, they became sources of wonder and adventure. From children's novels to historical epics, the Templars were depicted as keepers of forgotten relics, guardians of ancient truths. Archaeologists, inspired by romantic legends, scoured ruins for hidden chambers. Tourists flocked to Templar sites in France, Portugal, and the Middle East, eager to touch the stones of history where myth and fact blurred. The persistence of their image in nationalist, religious, and political narratives reveals something profound. The Templars were endlessly adaptable. For dictators, they symbolized order and obedience. For revolutionaries, they represented resistance against tyranny. For the Church, they were martyrs. For esotericists, guardians of secret wisdom. For soldiers, models of courage. For conspiracy theorists, architects of hidden empires. What tied all these interpretations together was the unresolved nature of their end. Because their suppression was so abrupt, so politically motivated, it left behind questions without answers. And unanswered questions are fertile ground for appropriation. In the 20th century, an age defined by ideology and propaganda, the Templars became not history, but mythic raw material, endlessly reworked to serve new agendas. By century's end, they had become symbols not just of medieval chivalry, but of the modern struggle to understand power, secrecy, and belief. The knights who once died defending castles in the Levant now lived again, in speeches, in symbols, in stories, in fears. Their legend had become global. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Knights Templar had crossed fully into the realm of popular culture. Their white mantles with red crosses no longer appeared only in medieval manuscripts or nationalistic propaganda. They now flashed across cinema screens, novels, video games, and television shows. The warrior monks had become global cultural icons, reimagined for audiences who craved mystery, conspiracy, and adventure. The appeal of the Templars lay in their contradictions. They were both monks and warriors, poor and rich, holy and accused of heresy, powerful and suddenly destroyed. Their history ended in fire and secrecy, leaving gaps that storytellers could fill with whatever their imagination desired. Where historical records left silence, fiction supplied answers. In literature, the 19th century romantic fascination with the Templars had already prepared the ground. Walter Scott's Ivanhoe depicted them as formidable villains. Later, writers such as Maurice Druon and Umberto Eco reimagined them as shadows behind medieval politics. But it was in the late 20th century that the Templars exploded into the mainstream of global fiction. Holy Blood, Holy Grail, 1982, offered a sensational reinterpretation, suggesting the Templars had protected a secret bloodline of Christ. Though dismissed by historians, it became a bestseller, blending speculative history with conspiracy narrative. Its influence reached millions more through Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, 2003, which transformed Templar myths into a global phenomenon. Brown's novel sold tens of millions of copies and inspired a blockbuster film, introducing mainstream audiences to the idea of Templars as guardians of hidden truths about Christianity. On screen, the Templars appeared in diverse forms. In Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, 1989, their legacy as Grail Guardians added mystery and gravitas. Historical epics, such as Kingdom of Heaven, 2005, portrayed them as violent zealots, emphasizing their role in the Crusades. In television series, from Nightfall, 2017, to countless documentaries, they became protagonists of dramatized history. Sometimes villains, sometimes heroes. They were always larger than life. Video games gave the Templars an entirely new afterlife. The Assassin's Creed franchise, launched in 2007, cast them as eternal antagonists, secret puppet masters seeking world domination. Players across the globe battled fictionalized Templars from Jerusalem to Renaissance Italy to revolutionary America. Through this medium, millions of young people encountered the Order not in history books, but as enemies in sprawling digital worlds. The franchise cemented the Templars' place in modern mythology as symbols of conspiracy and control. The tourism industry also embraced the legend. Castles in France, Portugal, and the Middle East marketed themselves as Templar sites, blending genuine history with myth. Round churches and fortress ruins drew visitors eager to imagine themselves walking in the footsteps of warrior monks. In Tomar, Portugal, the vast Convento de Cristo became a centerpiece for both national heritage and global fascination. Beyond entertainment, the Templars seeped into modern subcultures. Neo-Templar societies sprang up, some little more than fraternal clubs, others blending esotericism, nationalism, or charitable work. Freemasonry continued to claim symbolic connections, with some Masonic rites explicitly naming themselves Templar degrees. In online forums, conspiracy theories about Templar survival mixed freely with UFOs, secret societies, and apocalyptic prophecies. Why do they endure so strongly in popular culture? Partly because they embody timeless archetypes. They are the fallen heroes, destroyed unjustly. They are the hidden guardians, protecting treasures or secrets. They are the villains, ruthless and power-hungry. Few historical groups lend themselves so easily to all these roles at once, but their persistence also reflects modern anxieties. In an age of global corporations and hidden surveillance, the Templars resonate as metaphors for unseen power. In a time when many feel disconnected from tradition, they appear as symbols of loyalty, faith, and sacrifice. And in a world of skepticism, they embody the hunger for mystery, the possibility that behind the official story lies something greater, something secret. The irony is that while the historical Templars were destroyed 7 centuries ago, their cultural presence today is greater than at any point in their existence. More people know their name now than when they actually rode into battle. More recognize their red cross from movies and games than from medieval chronicles. In the end, the Templars in popular culture are less about what they truly were than about what modern societies need them to be. Storytellers reshaped them endlessly. Heroes, villains, conspirators, martyrs, projecting onto them the fears and dreams of each generation. Their legend is no longer bound by history. It has become a living myth. While legends in popular culture turned the Knights Templar into mythic figures, professional historians and archaeologists have labored to peel back centuries of exaggeration. Their task is delicate: to separate fact from fiction without stripping away the fascination that makes the Order so enduring. The search for the real Templars has revealed a story far more complex, and in some ways more compelling, than even the most imaginative conspiracy theory. The modern academic study of the Templars began in earnest during the 19th century, when medieval sources became more systematically cataloged and published. French scholars like Jules Michelet, who edited records from the trial of the Templars, provided the first detailed look into the accusations and confessions. These documents revealed not evidence of diabolical rituals, but of torture, coerced testimony, and political maneuvering. Michelet and his contemporaries argued that the order's destruction owed more to royal greed than to spiritual corruption. Throughout the 20th century, historical analysis expanded. Scholars studied the order not as a mysterious secret society, but as an institution embedded in the realities of medieval politics, religion, and economics. Historians like Malcolm Barber, Alain Demerger, and Helen Nicholson reshaped the narrative, presenting the Templars as disciplined warriors, innovative administrators, and financial pioneers. Their work emphasized continuity. The Templars were not anomalies, but part of broader trends in crusading, monasticism, and state formation. Archaeology added tangible depth to this re-examination. Excavations of Templar castles in the Holy Land, such as Chateau Pellerin and Safed, revealed the sophistication of their military engineering. The massive fortifications, water cisterns, and storage facilities testified to their logistical genius. In Europe, round churches modeled after the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem became focal points of study, offering insights into how the Templars symbolically connected their European commanderies with the sacred geography of the East. Material culture, coins, seals, manuscripts, further enriched understanding. The famous Templar seal depicting two knights on one horse, once thought to symbolize poverty, has been reinterpreted by some scholars as a sign of fraternity or humility. Financial records uncovered in archives revealed the order's role in creating systems of credit and safe deposit banking, challenging the myth that they stumbled into wealth accidentally. Instead, they emerge as careful innovators who understood both the needs of pilgrims and the demands of rulers. The Vatican's release of the Chinon parchment in 2001 provided perhaps the most dramatic confirmation of what historians had long suspected. This 14th century document revealed that Pope Clement V had absolved the Templars of heresy, recognizing their confessions had been forced. Though the papacy suppressed the order for political reasons, it never truly condemned them as guilty of the charges. The Chinon parchment showed that at the highest level, the Church had acknowledged the injustice. Despite this scholarly progress, challenges remain. The scarcity of surviving records means many aspects of Templar daily life remain obscure. We know little about the voices of ordinary sergeants or serving brothers compared to the high-ranking knights. Local practices often varied widely, yet evidence is fragmentary. Archaeological work in the Middle East continues to be hampered by modern political instability, leaving many Templar sites unexplored or inaccessible. Historians also face the problem of competing with myth. Academic findings rarely capture public imagination as powerfully as novels or games. While scholarship emphasizes the order's administrative paperwork, fortification designs, and financial ledgers, popular culture clings to the Holy Grail, secret rituals, and hidden treasures. This tension creates a dual legacy: the Templars of history, disciplined and pragmatic, and the Templars of legend, shrouded in secrecy. Yet for some scholars, this duality is precisely what makes the order so fascinating. The myths themselves reveal as much about modern societies as the historical evidence reveals about the medieval past. Why did Enlightenment thinkers see the Templars as martyrs of reason? Why did Romantic writers cast them as tragic heroes? Why do today's audiences imagine them as keepers of forbidden truths? Each reinterpretation reflects the needs and fears of its age. Recent interdisciplinary approaches push beyond traditional history. Anthropologists examine how the Templars became symbols of identity in places like Portugal or Scotland. Literary scholars analyze their role in shaping genres of historical fiction and conspiracy thrillers. Even digital archaeologists use 3D modeling to reconstruct Templar fortresses, allowing the public to walk through ruins that survive only in fragments. Ultimately, the historian's quest is not to kill the legend, but to balance it. The Templars were neither saintly martyrs nor sinister sorcerers. They were disciplined monks who fought, farmed, prayed, and administered. They were human beings caught between faith and politics, victims of the same ambitions that had once made them indispensable. By recovering this human dimension, scholars argue, we appreciate the Templars not less, but more. The modern pursuit of the real Templars is therefore a dialogue between evidence and imagination. Each excavation, each rediscovered parchment, peels away layers of distortion, even as new myths grow. The Order's true story remains compelling not despite the absence of treasure maps and Grail mysteries, but because of the very real challenges they faced, maintaining discipline across continents, surviving on hostile frontiers, and negotiating power with kings and popes. As archaeology and scholarship continue, the Knights Templar remain a bridge between fact and fiction, history and myth. The search for who they really were is not just about the past. It is about how we, in the present, choose to understand faith, power, and the allure of mystery. Long after the Order's suppression in 1312, the Knights Templar refused to vanish from collective memory. Their name and symbols lingered like echoes in Europe's imagination, reshaped and retold through centuries of legend, folklore, and speculation. Where historical records grew silent, stories grew louder. The Templars did not simply become history, they became myth. The first layer of myth was born in the 14th century itself, in the shadow of their persecution. The dramatic arrests on Friday the 13th, 1307, and the execution of Jacques de Molay created immediate fascination. Chroniclers described de Molay's defiant final words, allegedly cursing King Philip IV and Pope Clement V, who both died within the year. Whether literal or embellished, this narrative cast the Templars as martyrs, unjustly crushed by corrupt rulers. Their destruction seemed to demand supernatural vengeance, seeding a story of divine justice. Medieval folklore soon embroidered these themes. In rural France and Iberia, tales circulated of Templar treasure caravans, vanishing before royal officials arrived. Peasants whispered of underground tunnels connecting commanderies, where knights supposedly hid relics or gold. In Scotland, legends emerged of fugitive Templars aiding Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314, turning the tide of battle against England. These stories lacked firm evidence, but carried symbolic weight, offering hope that the Order had not truly perished. During the Renaissance, humanist writers rediscovered the Templars as figures of curiosity. Some emphasized their tragic fate as victims of tyranny, while others speculated about their supposed heresies. The Reformation deepened the myth. Protestant polemicists portrayed the Templars as martyrs to papal corruption, victims of Rome's greed. Catholic writers, in contrast, sometimes used them as cautionary examples of spiritual pride and corruption. In either case, the Order became a moral lesson more than a historical subject. The Enlightenment reinterpreted the Templars yet again. Free thinkers fascinated by secret societies claimed the Knights had preserved hidden wisdom suppressed by the Church. Voltaire and others hinted that the Templars represented reason stifled by superstition, courage undone by tyranny. This intellectual current planted seeds for later associations with Freemasonry, which incorporated Templar imagery into its rites. By the 18th century, Neo-Templar groups openly invoked their name, claiming continuity or inspiration, regardless of historical authenticity. Romanticism in the 19th century provided fertile soil for mythic expansion. Writers like Walter Scott cast the Templars as tragic villains, doomed by ambition, in novels such as Ivanhoe. Painters depicted their castles as ruins bathed in moonlight, symbols of vanished grandeur. Nationalist movements also seized upon their memory. Portuguese patriots celebrated the Order of Christ, successor to the Templars, as guardians of exploration and empire. In this era, the Templars became cultural symbols of mystery, loss, and nobility. The 20th century layered new myths on old foundations. Occultists like Aleister Crowley claimed esoteric connections to the Templars. Conspiracy theorists link them to the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or secret bloodlines. Books such as Holy Blood, Holy Grail, 1982, popularized speculative theories that blurred history with fantasy. By the time Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code appeared in 2003, the myth had reached global mass culture, with Templars portrayed as guardians of hidden truths, threatening the foundations of Christianity. Yet myth did not develop only in books and secret societies. Folk traditions carried their memory in more local ways. In parts of France and Spain, villagers spoke of spectral knights riding at night, protecting hidden treasure or guarding sacred sites. Place names preserve their memory. Temple and Templestowe, marking landscapes once under their control. Local festivals occasionally reenacted their suppression, blending pageantry with folklore. Why did these myths endure? Partly because the Templars embodied contradiction. They were holy warriors, sworn to poverty, yet guardians of vast wealth. They fought with steel but prayed with scripture. They were destroyed by kings, yet rumored to outlive kingdoms. Such paradoxes make for powerful stories, easy to reshape for different times and audiences. Memory also thrives on mystery. The secrecy of their initiation rites, the gaps in the trial records, the unexplored ruins of their castles, all left space for imagination. Where evidence ended, legend began. Each generation filled the silence with its own anxieties and hopes. Reformation polemicists with corruption, romantics with melancholy, modern seekers with conspiracy. Even today, Templar myths resonate because they offer both danger and promise. They suggest hidden knowledge just beyond reach. They present a brotherhood of loyalty and sacrifice, tragically undone. They warn of how power corrupts, yet whisper of treasures and secrets still waiting to be found. In a secular age hungry for meaning, the Templars function like mirrors, reflecting whatever mysteries people seek. Historians continue to push back against excess, but myths have their own power. They do not need to be true to shape culture. And the Templars, once flesh and blood men of prayer and war, live on in this realm of imagination, immortal not in reality, but in memory, banking, and their fiery downfall. Yet beyond the details of battles and trials lies a deeper question. What lessons can modern societies draw from their story? The Templars offer insights into power, institutions, faith, and the fragility of human ambition. Their rise and fall illustrate timeless truths about how organizations grow, succeed, and collapse. The first lesson is about purpose and discipline. From their founding in 1119, the Templars fused two seemingly incompatible identities, monks and warriors. Their discipline, balancing daily prayer with military readiness, gave them a unique strength. In a world of fragmented feudal loyalties, they created a transnational institution bound by shared vows. Their success stemmed not from wealth alone, but from a clear mission to protect pilgrims and defend Christendom. Modern institutions, too, thrive when their members embrace a shared purpose that transcends individual interests. The second lesson is about adaptability. The Templars did not remain static. They built castles in Syria, vineyards in France, and fleets in the Mediterranean. They shifted from protecting pilgrims to becoming bankers of kings. They adapted battlefield tactics to local conditions, borrowing ideas from Muslim and Byzantine foes. This ability to adjust kept them effective for nearly 2 centuries. Yet their decline shows the other side of the coin. When they could no longer adapt, when the Crusader states collapsed and their mission evaporated, they became vulnerable. Purpose and adaptability must evolve together. A third lesson lies in the danger of concentrated power without accountability. The Templars answered only to the Pope, exempt from local bishops and kings. This autonomy fueled their growth, but bred resentment. Their independence allowed them to serve across borders, yet it also isolated them when political winds shifted. To kings like Philip IV of France, they appeared as a state within a state, wealthy and untouchable. Once their mission in the Holy Land ended, their privileges seemed indefensible. The Templars' fate warns of the peril faced by organizations too powerful, too rich, or too independent to remain politically tolerable. A fourth lesson emerges from the role of reputation. For decades, the Templars symbolized bravery and piety, but reputation, however strong, can unravel overnight. The accusations of heresy, spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, were thin and inconsistent, yet they poisoned public opinion. Even if most people doubted the charges, the aura of suspicion stuck. Once reputation is compromised, truth often matters less than perception. Leaders and institutions today can learn that trust, once lost, is nearly impossible to recover. A fifth lesson is about the interplay of faith and pragmatism. The Templars embodied a paradox. They took vows of poverty, yet administered vast wealth. They preached holiness, yet engaged in brutal warfare. They lived as monks, yet negotiated with merchants and kings. This duality sustained them for a time, but also exposed them to criticism. Their story illustrates how ideals and practical realities must coexist in tension. When ideals are abandoned, corruption follows. When pragmatism is ignored, survival falters. The Templars remind us that sustaining both requires constant vigilance. There's also a lesson in the dangers of envy and greed. Philip IV's motives in destroying the Order were clear. He coveted their wealth and sought to remove a rival source of power. Yet history shows this is not unique. Throughout time, powerful institutions have been dismantled not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. Success attracts enemies. Wealth attracts predators. The Templars' end demonstrates that power makes organizations not only stronger, but also more vulnerable to attack. Another lesson touches on myth and memory. Despite their annihilation, the Templars survived in legend. Their symbols, stories, and mysteries outlived their castles and treasuries. This reveals a profound truth. Narratives endure longer than institutions. Leaders and organizations who focus only on structures may forget that their true legacy lies in the stories others tell about them. The Templars may have fallen in 1312, but in myth they never died. Finally, the Templar story underscores the fragility of human ambition. 9 knights in Jerusalem became the most powerful military religious order of their time, only to be broken by accusations, trials, and fire. Their rise was meteoric, their fall catastrophic. Yet even their failure carries lessons. Power is never permanent. Institutions must remain anchored to their mission, accountable to the societies they serve, and humble before the shifting tides of history. In the end, the Knights Templar embody a paradox, destroyed in body, immortal in symbol. Their castles crumbled, their wealth seized, their leaders burned, but their story still captivates 7 centuries later. The lessons they offer are not just medieval curiosities. They are warnings and inspirations for our own time, about purpose, adaptability, reputation, accountability, and the enduring power of myth. The Templars remind us that even the most formidable institutions can collapse overnight, but also that ideas, loyalty, courage, faith, and brotherhood can outlast walls of stone and flames of persecution. Their story teaches not despair, but perspective, that human endeavors are fragile, yet human memory is eternal. More than 7 centuries have passed since Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake on a small island in the Seine. His white mantle, consumed by fire, seemed at the time to mark the end of the Knights Templar. Yet paradoxically, that fiery death gave them a second life, not as a functioning order, but as one of the most enduring enigmas in human history. The Templar story is at once familiar and unique. Familiar because it echoes the arc of many great institutions. Humble beginnings, rapid ascent, overreaching power, and sudden collapse. Unique because few groups combined so many contradictions into a single identity. They were monks who fought, warriors who prayed, poor men who commanded vast riches, guardians of Christendom who were destroyed by fellow Christians. Their contradictions gave them both strength and vulnerability, inspiring admiration and suspicion in equal measure. Historically, their legacy is undeniable. They pioneered organizational structures that foreshadowed modern corporations and international NGOs. Their financial innovations laid groundwork for European banking, influencing credit systems and trust networks still recognizable today. Their castles reshaped military architecture, setting new standards in fortress design. Their discipline created some of the most formidable fighting units of the medieval world. In a time of feudal fragmentation, they embodied transnational cooperation, answering not to kings, but to a spiritual mission. Yet their influence cannot be measured in structures or systems alone. The Templars endure because they inhabit imagination as much as history. Legends of hidden treasure, secret rituals, and eternal survival have given them a cultural immortality no king or pope of their time enjoys. When modern audiences think of medieval mystery, the Templars appear first. Their red cross has become a shorthand for secrecy, loyalty, and lost power. Why do they continue to fascinate? Partly because their destruction left questions unanswered. The charges of heresy were never convincingly proven. The Shinon parchment revealed papal absolution, but too late to save them. Their treasure was never fully accounted for. Their sudden downfall looked less like justice than conspiracy. Gaps in the record became fertile ground for imagination. Where certainty ended, myth began. Each era has reinvented them. To Protestants, they were martyrs of papal corruption. To Romantics, they were tragic knights undone by fate. To Freemasons, they were ancestors in wisdom and ritual. To modern audiences, they are guardians of hidden truths, enemies in video games, or symbols of resistance against tyranny. In every retelling, the Templars reveal less about themselves than about the societies that remember them. There's also something archetypal in their fate. They embody the eternal drama of loyalty and betrayal, of power and downfall. Their story is not simply medieval, it is universal. Institutions rise, thrive, and fall. Leaders are exalted, then cast down. Ideals clash with politics. The Templars remind us that history is not only a chain of victories and defeats, but also a theater of human ambition, frailty, and resilience. For all their complexity, perhaps the deepest truth about the Templars lies in their humanity. Beneath the myths were men who prayed in candlelit chapels, rode out on dusty roads, fought on burning walls, and endured torture in cold cells. Their daily lives, half monk, half soldier, were shaped by faith, discipline, and danger. To remember them only as symbols is to risk forgetting that they were also flesh and blood, bound by vows, friendships, and hopes. Their story ends with dissolution, but their legacy never did. From Portuguese explorers flying their cross into the Atlantic, to modern novels weaving their symbols into mysteries, the Templars have become more than history. They are an idea about sacrifice, secrecy, power, and endurance. Few institutions achieve immortality in both fact and legend. The Templars did, and so their enigma endures. Were they saints or sinners, martyrs or conspirators? Historians debate, storytellers invent, believers imagine. But the truth may be simpler. They were human beings caught between faith and politics, ideals and ambition, loyalty and betrayal. Their rise and fall remind us of both the potential and the peril of combining spiritual purpose with worldly power. The Knights Templar began as 9 poor knights on the dangerous roads of Jerusalem. They ended as an institution destroyed by kings and popes. Yet in memory, they live on, endlessly reimagined, forever marching across the borders of history and legend. Their white mantles may have turned to ash, but their red cross still burns brightly in the imagination of the world.